Thank you everyone for coming along today. My name is Glenn and the company's ID, Informed Decisions, which is what it stands for. A lot of you be quite familiar with us as subscribers to our online toolkit. I've got some information for you today for the National Growth Areas Alliance about how your population is changing, and there's a lot of things happening in demographics at the moment, which are pretty profound as a result of COVID-19, and particularly the effect that's having on movement both within Australia and outside of Australia. So got a bit of an overview of what the current population trends are, what we might see from the census data, which is the 2021 census coming up in a bit over a month now. So there's a lot of information there. But just to start off with, just if you're not aware of who we are, we do work with over 250 councils around Australia, and we've been working with the NGAA and most members for over 12 years now. There's a dedicated community profile for the growth areas, which we've got online, and that provides a unique snapshot of the fast-growing outer suburbs across Australia. So that's the community profile that you can see there. Many of you also have within your own local government areas some of the other tools that we've got there, and I've got a slide on who's got what at this point as well. We do have an ongoing blog, and you can register for the slides, and there's my contact details as well. We're always happy to hear from any of our subscribing councils and the NGAA. So jump on and register for the briefing slides and sign up for our blog and monthly newsletter as well. So what's happening with Australia's population growth? We're getting new information all the time at the moment, but what we're seeing is that we've reached the end, very much reached the end now of a record period of population growth, which stretches back to about 2006 when the growth rate really took off Australia-wide. We have data up to the end of the 2019-20 financial year, and now we've got 6 months of data only at a state level since then. But there's some really interesting trends. What we see there is the growth rate was down a little bit for the year ended June 2020, but then there's this profound change it really happened from March 2020 when the pandemic hit. Our borders closed. We went into the national lockdown at that time, and the growth rate for the year ended December 2020 is only 0.5%. Now that is the lowest national growth rate recorded since 1916. So that's how profound that is. It's more than a century, and that was due to World War I and all the soldiers going off to war there. But you can see there that in the 6 months ended December 2020, that Australia's population actually declined slightly. Now, this is a really state-based trend. The financial year data by state still shows that up to June 2020, Victoria had the largest population growth, nearly 100,000 people for the year. But since then, it's really turned around. Queensland was the fastest growing state for that year. When you put the NGAA fast growing outer suburbs on the chart, you can see in percentage terms, growth for the year was actually the lowest growth rate for the NGAA in 10 years as a group, but it's going to be a lot lower than that. It will be potentially, in many areas, will actually be at 0 or negative, and overall NGAA is likely to have less than 1% growth for the next year, because this is what it looks like at a state level for the next 6 months. So 6 months to December 2020. We do have this information at the state level. We don't yet have this number for any of the local areas. So I can't tell you for your local government area where that change is distributed, but have a look at Victoria there. So the Victoria in 6 months has lost about 34,000 population. So that's a really big trend. At the same time, Queensland's growth is still lower than it has been because the overseas migration has stopped, but it is really, it's picked up growth from interstate migration. So Victoria's had the most COVID impact, and has lost people both interstate and overseas. it's likely that Victoria will experience for the full financial year ended June, so the financial year that we're about to end now, will lose about 1% of population for the year. And that's a pretty big change. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that. Probably what's a fairly minor component of the population growth is the birth rate. It has been a fairly minor population component of the population growth, but it is now, for the last year, it actually made up the majority of our population growth. The birth rate is lowest on record in 2019. We don't yet have the full 2020 figures. They'll come out in a few months. But what we can see is there's been this long-term shift towards people having kids later in life. And the preliminary figures that we've got for 2020, which are not finalised yet, do show it's fairly stable, about 1.65, but there's no evidence of what some people were talking about, which was a lockdown baby boom from 9 months after March of last year. It didn't happen, but it seems to not at least be falling any further. If you have a look at the NGAA, Australia's birth rate was 1.66. For the fast-growing outer suburbs, it was 2.01, which is almost replacement level. That has tracked downwards, though, for the last few years. So it's still high, but it is declining as well. But the birth rate you would expect in the fast-growing outer suburbs to be significantly higher, and that is going to be the main form of population growth in many areas in the next couple of years. And that's because overseas migration is not happening anymore. In fact, it is happening. It's immigration, net immigration, and that's the first time. Certainly on that chart, but I'm pretty sure that's the first time in 100 years that we've got net immigration for the whole country. And it's not a small amount. For 6 months, it was minus 66,000. So 66,000 more people left the country than came in long term. And that means that total population growth for 2020-21 is likely to be negative or flat for the whole year. You can see I actually had to extend the chart to the negative. I've always had this chart starting at zero because we always have positive migration. And the interstate migration, COVID has really turned this completely around. So Victoria has gone from in 1 year having substantial in-migration to substantial out-migration. Queensland has always had substantial in-migration and now is having more of it. And that really offsets the migration loss out of Queensland to overseas, which is still negative in Queensland as well. And WA, the numbers aren't huge compared to the other states, but WA has turned from a interstate migration loss to a gain. And it's also worth mentioning South Australia, which has had a small interstate migration gain for the first time in 25 years. It typically loses people interstate. It's a very, very small. It's not contributing a lot to their population, but it isn't negative. New South Wales, still negative. It's always negative in New South Wales. People do leave the area, do leave the state of New South Wales, mainly because it's a first port of call for migrants. I'll just quickly go through these. These are only up to June 2020, so they don't tell that most recent story, unfortunately, but you can see where the growth is around each state. In Victoria, your areas in the fast-growing outer suburbs are out here, and most of them were still recording strong growth up to June 2020. Most of that growth was prior to the March quarter, though. City of Brimbank, which is not in the NGAA, is actually already, at that time, was experiencing population decline. You will see in Victoria in the next financial year a lot of areas into that population decline category. The New South Wales, there you can see the same areas. You've got Blacktown and the Hills and Camden with the strong population growth, and generally all the way along the coast and most of Sydney in the moderate growth range. Queensland, very focused growth on southeast Queensland and parts of the coast there, particularly Gold Coast and Ipswich and Moreton Bay having strong population growth. While in Western Australia, it's a slightly different story. You've still got the fast-growing outer suburbs growing there. City of Perth's also a high growth area. And in South Australia, you've got City of Adelaide there and Mount Barker being in the highest growth range. So you do have access to all of this information online on your community profile, which is an online information tool, publicly accessible. We've just rolled out a new set of areas which you can look at each state's growth areas in aggregate. So you can look at the Victorian growth areas and the New South Wales growth areas and so on there. So it's a new one. You're welcome to look at that. Of course, many of you have got your own community profiles for your own local area, which you go down to the suburb level. The NGAA is a nice summary of what's happening for the whole area and then also state by state there. And we're looking at rolling out the 2021 census data from June 2022. This is just a little tick list of which tools are at which of the member council websites, so who's got what. You can see most subscribers to the community profile atlas and the population forecast, quite a few on our economic profile, and there's also housing ID, which is our newest tool there, which a few have picked up there. You can see the other ones in there, so if there's an interest in that one in particular, let me know. What we do have newly on the community profile, we don't have a lot of information post-census. It's mainly a census profile, but we do have some migration data, and this is internal migration. We've now got these figures for internal migration for each year. So every year we get an update on who's moving where, and it's really important to understanding that trend in your population, particularly for your growth areas, because they have traditionally got most of their population growth from internal migration, from people moving in from other parts of our capital cities, and basically moving outwards within the metropolitan area. What we see is a consistent movement since the census up to June 2020 of 50,000 or so people per year into the NGAA areas. And that's driven by movement out of the inner to middle ring suburbs, but there are also losses to regional areas, and you can see that in New South Wales movement. So these are the NGAA areas in New South Wales. There's movement out to Central Coast, to just over to Hawkesbury, which is not in the NGAA but is also urban fringe, and then broadly to the regional areas. So these are all elements of the same map, which you can see on the NGAA site. Particularly strong losses to regional areas in Victoria and to some extent New South Wales. So you can see there from the NGAA, you're gaining in Victoria from the southeastern suburbs, from the western suburbs there into those growth areas, but losing to Geelong there, Moorabool and Bawbawshire on the other side. And that's part of the same migration corridor, but that has accelerated in that last year, which includes the first post-COVID information. So there's certainly evidence that people are moving outwards within the metropolitan area and then also outwards to regional areas. So there's a drain from NGAA areas to regional. Queensland shows a clear migration corridor with the growth areas between Brisbane, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast. So you're moving out from Brisbane to Moreton Bay to Sunshine Coast, Brisbane to Logan to Gold Coast. And South Australia and WA are doing their own thing. Interestingly, particularly WA showing a trend of movement back out of outer areas into the inner city, which is exactly the opposite trend that we see in the eastern states. Eastern states, we're seeing this movement out of the inner cities now, particularly post-COVID. So this is just a little bit of information about the cultural diversity. And I think I presented this at my last presentation to NGAA, but it's worth mentioning again. You've gone from 15% in 1996 speaking a language other than English at home to 25% in 2016. So it's an extra 716,000 people in 20 years speaking a language other than English, about 40% of total population growth. So quite a bit of that growth, although a lot of it comes from internal migration, a lot of it is due to overseas migration. Some of it's secondary overseas migration, not necessarily the first place that people land when they get to Australia in the NGAA areas, but they're upgrading to that area. And you can see that as well on here. NGAA is an upgrader area, but it is really dependent on that overseas migration. some of the and the cultural diversity has really been increasing in those outer suburbs quite significantly in the up to the 2016 census. And of course, we'll know more from the 2021 census. But what this means is that that secondary growth you're getting from the upgraders, it could actually continue. There could be an inertia and a lag. So you might still see the NGAA areas, and I'm mainly probably talking about Victoria and New South Wales here, which have got which are going to have profoundly lower population growth in the next couple of years. You may still see some growth in the NGAA as people continue to move outwards in the metropolitan area. And there might be a lag even when overseas migration starts up again. And we don't know when the borders are going to open again. No one knows, and it's a hot topic. But whether there'll be a large influx of people coming back in, we don't know. There will likely to be a dip as there are less people coming in from overseas and potentially less from the internal migration in the secondary sense there as well. We already see that in Brimbank, for example, in Melbourne. It's a first port of call for migrants, and it was immediately hit there with the loss. A lot of that is because those ones that are already in Brimbank are moving out to Melton, which is a fast-growing outer suburb. But that's eventually going to impact on Melton's population growth as well. We've also got new information on the profile site about the socioeconomic characteristics. We look at JobSeeker numbers, and we update this every month. You can see the percentage of your population of working age who are accessing JobSeeker. NGAA's overall JobSeeker rate was just in April 2021, so quite recently, 7.9%, which is higher than the national rate of 7%, but it's fallen quite substantially from about the middle of last year when the peak of the pandemic unemployment hit. But it's really socioeconomic based. So Playford among the NGAA areas is the highest, but also Mandurah in Western Australia and Logan in Queensland having rates over 10%. Whereas your higher socioeconomic areas like the Hills, Wallandilly and Camden are all under 3%. So we can see how that's affecting that as well. There's a bit of information there about housing ID, all about affordable housing and how and what supply and demand and availability of affordable housing there is in your area. Let me know if there's any interest in that one. So a lot to cover there, and I will do that in a little bit more detail in the symposium, which is coming up in a month. But basically, you've had a lot of population growth. It's been, in the last few years, really the epicenter of multicultural growth in Australia. But overseas migration has stopped for a moment. So don't expect that population growth is going to continue everywhere. It might a bit more in Queensland, but even in those areas, you are going to have lower growth than you have before. It's quite likely that in the Victorian NGAA areas, you'll have 0 to maybe even negative growth for a few years. So there's a few points in there about what are some of the challenges. COVID obviously presents a challenge and is going to hit your areas, but it's also an opportunity to change the way we work. Work from home has taken off in some areas and is likely to continue. We'll know more from the 2021 census, and I'm going to expand on that on the symposium presentation as well. But really, a lot of this we're waiting on the 2021 census to tell us more about what's happening in every area, really, in Australia. So make sure you're filling the census form and encourage others to do so. August 10th is census night, and we've got the data probably coming out around about the middle of next year. Just a little bit on the forecast. We also do forecasts for a lot of NGAA areas. The growth rate, which we forecast 3.3%, we are gradually changing these over because we haven't yet done all of the post-COVID forecasts. So we can't give you an overall growth rate for the future. And there's a lot of guesswork involved, particularly when those borders are likely to reopen. Our national forecasts show that we're expecting nearly 2 million less people in Australia's population by 2041. That's based primarily on less overseas migration. So NGAA will make up some of that difference. And so our current forecast of 7.9 million is almost certainly an overestimate, but it's really state dependent. Queensland and WA are likely to still see significant growth, while a lot of members in Victoria are likely to see population declines or flat population for the next few years. And that can have implications for the age structure and who you're providing services for as well. So our forecasts are gradually being updated to this, but they haven't been all updated as yet. We have added those state-based growth overlays, growth area overlays to the NGAA profile, so you can compare and benchmark to each as a group. So there's a few resources there. Your community profiles available online. Most members have at least their own community profile with suburb level information, and we're always happy to help with ongoing training and support for all staff and users of the data. So feel free to get in touch if you'd like more information on what you already have, what else we can provide, and our consultancy services as well. So if you'd like to register or contact me, please use that QR code, or you can contact me direct with the details there. So thank you everyone for your time, and I hope that's been some useful information. Thank you.